Hi, this is Paul. I want to do a little bit of work on sort of the status of the hyperobjects, principalities and powers, spirits conversation right now. This has been a continual topic of conversation in terms of the corner. I the on-ramp challenge for this little corner is a significant one, and I've been thinking more and more about that challenge and how to break what's going on down into some constitutive parts that are fairly easy to talk about. One of those parts is the combinatorial explosiveness, and Jordan Peterson has been talking about that recently, about why that is pushing the counter enlightenment, we'll call it that. Why that is pushing the counter enlightenment, because it's clear that the enlightened work frameworks are no longer adequate to deal with what even science is forcing us to look at. Now, I would argue that a lot of the enlightenment paradigms have never been adequate to deal with what we are facing. And in fact, I think there's been a lot of willful ignorance and blindness with respect to it. And one of the areas of this has to do with principalities and powers, spirits, hyperobjects. Language is going to be key in terms of making progress in this area. Now, two recent videos out on this. Jonathan Pageau had a really outstanding conversation with Seraphim Hamilton. And I know that was out on Seraphim's channel, and the YouTube algorithm was signaling me like crazy to watch it, and I didn't. And then Jonathan posted it on his channel, and other people were sending me messages to watch it. So this morning I finally gave in and got through it, and it's just an absolutely terrific conversation. And Seraphim at the end of the conversation basically says, yeah, Seraphim, you push me in some areas that are really good. And he's right. Seraphim was really at some of these areas, and I really enjoyed a lot of elements of this conversation. But it sort of pushed Jonathan to talk about some of these things. And then I want to go to a new video by John Vervaeke and Jordan Hall on this topic. So let's start with Jonathan.
Let me back up a little bit and try to, I think, kind of contextualize what's happening in terms of this new interest in, like you said, a more populist universe. One of the things that
Now, I like the way he phrased that, a more populist universe, because my contention all along has been part of the scientific lab leak has been the promotion of the idea that there is no consciousness nor agency above human beings, period. And it's even limited the allowance, or at least the public recognition, of even collective human consciousness. And that's a huge problem. The Enlightenment tried to basically put humanity in an iron box and said there's nothing above us, and below us is insignificant. Now, one of the areas at the consciousness and conscience conversation, which mostly talked about consciousness, and when I talked to John Vervaeke, I challenged him on, we can at least see layers of consciousness below us. The dog that is resting in this crate beneath me clearly has a layer of consciousness that is analogous to my own, but not at my level. And my argument was, we have a lot of evidence of agency above us. Is there consciousness above us? Now, that gets very difficult because it's very easy to imagine that the experience that I have of consciousness is different from the experience my dog has of consciousness. And we don't know what consciousness is really like for a dog. We know dogs very well. Dogs live with us. If there is another species of mammal that we are close with, I'd say we're clearly closer with dogs than with cats. Cats are fun. I like having a cat as a house pet. I've had a number of cats as house pets, but dogs have a special place in my heart because dogs cooperate with us at a level that I don't believe cats do. and we can, to a degree, share a level of consciousness with a dog that I'm not sure we can do with a cat, even though cats are amazing creatures. Now, the difficulty, of course, we have is that we even struggle to talk adequately about consciousness in and of ourselves. Now, at the Thunder Bay conference, I thought John gave an excellent lecture on consciousness, which really opened up some things. I'm going to listen to that lecture again. But where I continue to disagree is I don't think we can out of hand dismiss consciousness and agency above us. That was one of the key things that the Enlightenment did. And again, in terms of the development of science, the scientific method basically assumed when Galileo drops a sphere from a tower in Italy, spirits aren't going to interfere. And so for a limited set of things, there's sort of buffering. Now, this is going to get really complex. I agree with what Jonathan is saying in this video, that as increasingly people once again culturally are opened up to agency and consciousness above and below, especially above, it's going to make for some crazy things. And some of this agency already is machine agency. And, we don't really know what AI is going to do in this. Well, let's listen to Jonathan talk some more.
That happened, of course, in 19th century materialism was the evacuation of agency in the cosmos as superstition, right? The idea that every time you see agency in the cosmos, or that you see other consciousness acting in the cosmos, it's just superstition and projection. That's the type of word they use. But that type of thinking, this materialist type of thinking, didn't come to the point of trying to account for our consciousness and our agency. And they were just ignoring it as this kind of blind spot from a point of view where they looked on the world with that agency and consciousness, but then used their reason and their agency and consciousness to evacuate the rest of the universe of agency and consciousness.
And I think that blind spot that they maintained is part of the reason for the meaning crisis, because they practice that projection and evacuation and ideas of illusion. And then very quickly, we found ourselves in the mirror and said, well, am I a person? Do I have agency? I certainly experience consciousness, but consciousness is a really fudgy word, because what you see very quickly is that people and you saw this in the 60s and 70s, consciousness raising. Oh, what exactly is that? Well, it's a collective conscious, and of course, Jung had the collective unconscious. So very quickly that word gets fudgy, because we have a sense that and John Vervaeke, I think, if I recall that lecture correctly in Thunder Bay, he very much limited consciousness in a very specific way. Now, as a scientist, you do this because that is the scientific process. You try to reduce variables down to the you do relevance realization event, essentially. You try to reduce the variables down to a limited subset that you're actually able to track and follow with cause and effect outcomes. And if you can do that, then the idea, science, almost continually becomes the servant of technology, because it becomes the servant of our wills, and then we very much want to take control of our environment. So the rigorous practice of this in the Enlightenment afforded this deeply powerful technology that allowed us to do a number of things, but of course, with all of that technology came unintended consequences.
Consciousness. And so I think that we've come to a point where even a lot of scientists and a lot of, especially scientists that study cognition, they're realizing that this is a ridiculous position to stand in. It's a ridiculous position to ignore the categories of consciousness when we're literally using those categories to evacuate the cosmos of consciousness. So I think that's the point where we've come to, where now there are people, very reasonable, people that aren't Christian, that are atheists or secular, or all kinds of people that are willing and in some ways realize that using categories of agency and consciousness to understand certain phenomena is actually more useful than the kind of cold analytical description that they're used to, especially for understanding social movements, for understanding kind of large scale transformations, using things like agency to explain those. What people use the term egregore, they use different, they use things like emergence, words like emergence. In some ways, it doesn't matter to us at the outset what word they use, but they're noticing something like intelligent patterns kind of coming back and manifesting themselves on the world. So once you've crossed that threshold, and this is the funny thing that a lot of people don't realize, once they cross that threshold and they ride that out consistently, they will find themselves once again in a world of jinns and fairies and intermediary beings. And I think that you're seeing a lot of people talk about re-enchantment. You have Rod Dreher. I just read an article by Mary Harrington today that tries to talk about re-enchantment, people taking mushrooms, talking about all these beings that they meet and everything. And I think that that's the future. If you want to know what the future is, that's it. But it's a scary, it's not that great of a future. It's scary because without order, without the logos ordering that world for us, then it's a very scary and dangerous world to walk through. So
and the reason it's going to be scary is I just about my whole adult Christian life. So the church that I went to in college was a Christian Reformed church, but it was also a little bit Pentecostal, a little bit charismatic. It wasn't Pentecostal, it was charismatic. And so we paid attention to a lot of the talk about spiritual warfare and a lot of this kind of stuff that was sort of after the 70s. It was continuing. I was at that church in the 80s. It was continuing in the culture at that time. And there was always this notice that we begin to notice that there's sort of a door in reality that when this door gets open, a lot of things come in. And one of the things that people noted was that you needed Jesus to be your doorkeeper. You needed the Holy Spirit to be the bouncer at the door, because unless you have dominion over that door, or someone who does have dominion over that door, you yourself will be subject to whatever can come through that door. And that is a very scary thing. Recently, someone sent me this DW documentary. I haven't watched the whole thing yet. Is Control of Knowledge Power? And one of the things that, I'm not going to play any of it because you never know with YouTube. I really don't want to have, I don't want to get into copyright issues, even though this is such clearly fair use. So here you have this woman who is kind of going around asking all of these questions and trying to figure it out. And then she goes to Africa. And it was so interesting to me where she's talking to this one person. This one woman clearly has a Christian shirt on, and she's talking to these workers who are doing different things. And then she decides she's going to contrast she's saying that, Africa is sort of run amok with Pentecostal prosperity preachers, and that somehow is evil colonialism. But this woman who is basically a witch practicing all of this indigenous spirituality, well, she's the way forward. And it's like, you don't really, what's so amazing is that so much of this anti-colonialism is so absolutely colonial. It's so fundamentally colonial, because if you would ask many Africans, and I worked with Haitians and Dominicans with this stuff, if you would ask people why do you turn to Christianity? You can find this in Navajo population, in Native American populations. You can find this all over the world. Part of the reason Christianity is so powerful in terms of converting people who have not been sort of converted by an axial age religion is because so many of them are desperate to get out of the shamanism and the animism that have possessed them. And I remember reading accounts of Navajo spirituality, the constant dealing with demons and avoiding evil spirits and all of this work. In some ways it's sort of analogous to what Augustine points at in City of God, where the Romans are just the weight of trying to manage the spiritual world is just so overwhelming in terms of the number of gods you need to name and the number of temples you need to build and the number of sacrifices you need to employ. Tom Holland talks about, in late antiquity, part of the reason that there's so much overthrow of Roman emperors is that they're all trying to find one god to rule them all. And of course, Constantine settles on Jesus and Christianity, and then eventually it's going to settle in because the spiritual world is at rest, and now suddenly there is someone who has conquered the principalities and powers. But I find people just sort of rushing to open the door again, and I'm thinking, yeah, I don't think this is going to get you what you're looking for. Now, when I saw John Vervaeke had done a video on hyperobjects, it immediately caught my attention because that's the term. John will talk about collective consciousness, but hyperobjects tends to be the term he uses. It's by no means my favorite term in this reaching for new terminology, or at least struggling to find a common language. But what he does at the beginning of this conversation with Jordan Hall, I think, is lay out in a very clear way a language by which a lot of people who are within that iron box of that iron box that the Enlightenment sort of put us in, you can begin to understand that this isn't crazy talk or woo or just a superstitious vestige of another world. We are constantly talking about these entities, and we struggle in terms of knowing how to assess agency and especially consciousness because we are small and we don't know, and our lifetimes are severely limited and our agency is severely limited. But I thought what John does here is super helpful, so I'm just going to start playing that.
A topic to Jordan, which I thought might give us some additional conceptual vocabulary, theoretical grammar. And I'm also going to point to a third thing it might give us, which is, and I'm going to argue for this, Morton doesn't, but I'm going to argue for this, a religious attitude that may be appropriate to bringing about what he advocates for, which is attunement to reason. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that a lot of this comes out of, I read Hyperobjects by Morton in collaboration with my good friend and colleague, Dan Chappie. And I'm not going to keep referencing him, but I just want to acknowledge that, my thinking is shared with him because we read the book together and collaborated together. And so when I proposed this to Jordan, Jordan thought that was a great idea. He is familiar with the term, but he wants to get into it more. And so there's two things we kind of want to explore here. One is more properly, what is a hyperobject and what's the nature of their existence? And then more long-term, what's the relevance of this? And I have a specific proposal about that. And the proposal is going to go something like this. I'm going to use a great literary example, as an analogy. In the Republic by Plato, Plato tries to understand what it is to be a just person. And the psyche is, of course, very hard. And so what he does is he blows it up and he creates a corresponding model of the Republic. Hence the name of the book, a city. And by having that larger picture that's external to our own identity, we can get a better idea of justice. And then what we can do is move back and forth between the justice of the psyche and the justice of the city, and that actually affords our transformation in a process that he calls the ascent or anagoge.
Now, I think that is a terrific way to go about it, and I think actually people have been working this way with respect to spirits, hyper objects, principalities and powers, this middle realm. I've spoken before that part of what happened in missiology is that missionaries went from the developed West to much of the rest of the world, and Hyber, I believe that's his name, I'm not pulling up the material for us right now, talked about the excluded middle. And this is very much what we're talking about here. And in missiological terms, when they would go to Africa or Asia or Latin America, many of these places outside of Christendom, you would have a middle realm which were filled with these spirits, entities, so on and so forth. The West believed, well, we didn't have that, but we had a middle realm filled with all sorts of other things. And in a sense, what Hyperobjects does is begin to bring those things, help us to see the middle realms in the West. And now we're starting to understand a little bit of what the rest of the world saw. So, and I think John's intuition of using Plato's Republic, of sort of, okay, scaling up, well, that's what the world had always done. The fairies, the middle realm entities were like us, but not like us. And that's what we're going to have to, in that way, it's sort of analogous to exaptation. You take something of our, we already know we have all this mechanism that we use to see with, and now when we close our eyes, we're going to use to imagine. And so this, I think, also is close to John Vervaeke's imaginal. And so we're going to use this to sort of, okay, how can we talk about the middle realm?
And what I'm going to propose is something very similar is being argued for by Morton. The appearance on our individual and cultural radar of hyper objects is startling. He calls it a quake in being. But if we pursue it carefully, we come to realize that the hyper object, according to Morton, actually reveals properties of every object, of everything. And therefore, it demands from us a fundamental transformation in our relationship to all of being. And that's why it has
And again, that's another great point where you just said it's going to be startling, it's going to be unnerving. And we already have this, let's say, the kind of anxiety that is in the culture with respect to climate change, global warming, whatever term you want to use, or AI. We're finding these threats deeply unsettling. And it's just that whereas, let's say, the Navajo or the African was worried about evil spirits, we were seeing them in a certain register. And we were seeing them through a specific Enlightenment narrative. And so they were immediately dismissed in certain ways that, let's say, European monastic missionaries, when they were evangelizing the Germanic tribes, there was a very different exchange than, when we sort of tell the story about cutting down Odin's tree. It's a different thing for us than it was for them. But yes, so the more we recognize the power of these hyperobjects, the more terrifying it's going to become. And Jonathan, was talking about that in that video to a degree. But also, the more all other things around us it's very similar to when Jordan Peterson says, "What is a car?" Well, I know what a car is. I've got one parked over there in the parking lot. No, 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 no. You don't understand you don't understand the spiritual power of the car in terms of transforming life and transforming our bodies, transforming human relationships, transforming churches, transforming just about everything. And so we're beginning to see the spiritual power of technology, let's say.
As I said, this transformative, religious aspect to it. So how does that sound, Jordan, as a way of going forward?
Awesome. That sounds great.
Okay, so I thought what I'd do is I'll go through the 4 sort of central properties of hyperobjects while talking about a couple of examples. So let's take 2 examples, and I choose them because they come from sort of different domains in some senses, but not in others. One is the process of evolution, and then the other is global warming. Okay. Now, what are some of the properties that we should note about these entities? Well, first of all, they are in some sense entities. We think of them as having an existence. They form some kind of intelligible whole to us, although we'll have to negotiate that intelligibility. Right? And they're not just an aggregate of other things like a pile of rocks or something like that. They have behaviors, causal behaviors that can be attributed to them as a whole, and also we can see them as having parts that are coordinated together, etc. I won't get into the deep ontology, but the idea is they form a respectable unity in our mind. But what's unusual about them is they don't have the kind of unity that we attribute to our prototypical objects. So here's my jackknife. This is a prototypical object. Notice it has parts and the parts interact, but notice what I can do with it. It is local. It has a determinate Cartesian coordinate specificity in time and place. And here it is. Here it is. And if it's here, it can't be here.
Okay, let's pause there because the fact that his jackknife has parts, if you go back a few years and we're talking about what is a chair and the legs of the chair and the fact that, this again is stuff we've talked about in the TLC for a while, you see it as a chair. You see that as a jackknife. You don't see it as a blade and a handle, although you can distinguish the blade and the handle. And you can also understand the hinge, and you can also understand the latch. All of these pieces, and you can understand the wooden part of the handle versus the metal part of the handle, and all of these things, but you see it as one thing. So there's one level of it. Now he's going into the other level of it, that it has locality, and it has, let's call it discrete locality. It is here but not there. It is here but not there. It can't be in 2 places at once.
Right now, it can take up a continuous space, but it is localized. Now, the first important property about hyperobjects like global warming and evolution is they're non-local. You can't point and say, there, in Wisconsin, right? There's evolution. It's like, well, no. What do you mean? Evolution doesn't work. It's not, you can't point to a particular time and space. Now, that doesn't mean it's an eternal object like 2 + 2 = 4, because it's taking place in time and space. So this is very tricky for us. We have these 2 sort of categories we've developed in the West. The concrete, there it is, time and space. The abstract, not in time and space, 2 + 2 = 4. And then we have the strange intercategorical non-locality of things like evolution and global warming. And let's remember that when things are intercategorical, they horrify us, they terrify us, because they point to the cracks in our intelligibility. This is Mary Douglas's classic proposal as to what is horrifying. Okay, so they're non-local. Now, what I just said points to the second feature, which he calls their viscosity. So it's tempting when we start to think about hyperobjects to either try to picture them as concrete objects, or to do the opposite, with which we can be intimate, or point to them as abstract objects that we can then distance ourselves from in detachment and reflection. And the problem with evolution and global warming is we can't do that. They are simultaneously abstract and intimate. Evolution is happening in me right now. It's happening in Jordan right now. It's happening in all of you. But that isn't the sum total of evolution. Evolution's also happening in Australia. It's happening in Africa. It's happening in Asia. It happened in the deep past. It's going to be happening in the deep future. A future and a past without us.
Now, before we get to that point that he just made, which is a critically important point, it's also helpful to know that the word evolution that he's using, well, very quickly, in many different contexts, there's going to be a conversation. Well, what aspect of this are you talking about? Are you talking about a certain degree of transformation? Is it, how big is this evolution you're talking about? Now, he's obviously not going there, because the quality of evolution that he's talking about is serving as an illustration for what he's doing. But pay attention that it is very different from talking about a lens cap. Even though the lens cap, again, can be used as a coaster for a drink, can be used as, if I was gonna, when cultures have these giant things, maybe a gauge for my ear, be a massive gauge for my ear. It could be used as it could be used in a lot of different ways, a little circular thing like this. But evolution, well, and also it's like, again, not only is it non-local, but it doesn't work on the same time frames that we do.
Without us, it happened in the deep past. It's going to be happening in the deep future. A future and a past without us. Without us. It transcends in that manner. So this is what he means by viscous. We are stuck inside of them. They are bigger than us, but we are stuck inside of them. So our usual strategies of control over the concrete and detachment with the abstract are not available to us.
Okay, right there is something really key. Our strategies of control. Because so much of what happened in the Enlightenment was about strategies of control. Cholera. Is cholera a hyperobject? Yes and no. Because cholera has a specific... Cholera is more like, let's say, Cocker Spaniel than evolution. And so what the Enlightenment helped with were strategies of control to deal with cholera. Now, a hyperobject like plague is different from cholera, because you have a strategy of control that you can employ using Enlightenment tools to deal with cholera, but plague is a different category. And so maybe we'll deal with cholera, maybe we'll deal with malaria, maybe we'll deal with influenza. Influenza has been trickier. And then, of course, when COVID came along, maybe we'll deal with the Black Death. And so again, and plague is kind of a funny word, because there are diseases that are called plague. If you go up into the mountains, for example, I remember going up to Mammoth. It's an area here in the Sierra. Going there when we were first exploring in the first years we were here, we went to this beautiful area, and there were signs warning us of plague. It's like, oh, that's the plague. Well, watch out for rodents, because some of these rodents are carrying the plague, and it's like, wow, I better be careful up here. But so again, this is naming and getting specific is super helpful here.
So we have to have another way of relating to these kinds of realities. The third thing about them is what he calls temporal undulation. They they resist our sort of temporal grasp. He makes a really interesting point. He says, we're pretty good with the small finite and the infinite. We can go, yeah, I get that. But the really, really large is actually very hard for us. And so when we like the timescales of evolution, the timescales at which global warming or other things are happening exceed either the finitely graspable or the abstract infinite. And so again, we are like, this is what I mean by temporal undulation. They come into our time space, right? He gives the example of it's raining now and it doesn't usually rain, but because of global warming, it's raining. So the raining is global warming, or the fact that I'm getting more sunburned is global warming. But of course, that's not the whole of global warming. The global warming is also due to, the processes happening in the sun and tectonic things happening on the earth.
Okay, due to, and this is again where, okay, plague, well, maybe we'll manage cholera and maybe we'll manage malaria and we'll try to manage influenza, and COVID we've been wrestling with, but maybe plague is the wrong word because it works sort of double duty there. And then when you get something like global warming, well, the time frames are massive. I was just, maybe I'll pull in this because another great conversation. So let's talk about population collapse. Often, one of the things that people note in California, which is a place that is prone to drought, is when a hurricane comes through, you call it Katrina. It comes in, a series of days it will come in and say destroy New Orleans or Hurricane Andrew, some of these big hurricanes that have come through. We don't name droughts because droughts, even on a small frame, but droughts are even something that we can sort of see. It's a multi-year function. But then there are these other spirits that are going through the world, and one that's going through South Korea right now, and in fact impacting all the world. We can call it, again, a hyperobject, if you will, but there's no name on it.
Then why wouldn't you say, actually, no, I'd rather make this next promotion?
Well, the modern culture prioritizes pleasure in the here and now and short-termism over everything else.
I think human beings just do that as well.
Yeah, but maybe there was, I don't know, maybe you're right.
And you can especially see it when you're talking about something like culture. We're talking about culture, and culture is a massive hyperobject, let's say. And
but it seems like there was definitely a preparedness to invest now for returns in the future, more so. Our ability to, the marshmallow test was more effective 100 years ago for most.
I think because culture kind of...
And again, Jordan Peterson would call this sacrifice. Culture, you had a culture of sacrifice. And of course, the culture gets carried down. People don't necessarily know the reasons for it, but they still practice it because that's just what you do.
I think good culture serves the purpose of channeling making people more long-termist, because our natural inclination is to be short-termist, most of us. The thing is with having children is like, you're short-termist because you want to have sex and then, oh, whoops, a baby came along. Like normally you don't have to think about that.
Yeah, that was evolution's big trick, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly. But now...
I thought you were just having fun. Guess what? The next 19 years of your life are...
Oh, there's evolution, that darn hyperobject.
Locked off. Yeah.
And there's a certain elegance to that, right? But we've lost that because of contraception. And now there are still groups, there are still cultures, there are still people who just love babies and will have loads of kids because they just get so much joy from babies, which is great. I'm one of those people. I would rather have loads of kids and earn less money. I've made that rational decision. But for a lot of people, that's not an obvious choice. Some cultures are still channeling people into being more traditionalist, being more long-termist. But the mainstream culture absolutely isn't doing that. And the very likely consequence of that is that, I can't remember the numbers exactly, but South Korea, you'll know, has the lowest fertility rate in the world.
For every 100 South Koreans, there will be 4 great-grandchildren.
Right. Like, there's never been a plague that has knocked out that many people.
The 96% extinction rate over the next 100 years
Incredible.
of Koreans.
Yeah.
Remembering that we shut down the entire world for something that kills 1 to 2% of people.
Yeah.
Is that a hyperobject?
It's crazy.
Yeah.
It's the most incredible evolutionary bottleneck that we're going through.
In other news, this episode.
Up. The commercial. Let's get through the commercial. YouTube Premium doesn't exempt me from those.
It's not an existential risk in the traditional sense of permanent, unrecoverable collapse. It's not a classic version of it.
Yeah.
But it's a population risk that's very unique in that there's no smoke in the sky, there's no asteroid heading toward Earth, there's no lead measure if you're looking until it's way too late.
Yeah.
Right? You don't feel it getting warmer. You don't even feel it getting quieter, because we've got an aging population whilst a reducing birth rate, which means that you can have more people on the planet while fewer are being made. So you can almost predict out that.
So it feels really counterintuitive, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
demography is destiny.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, I definitely think that a big chunk of it is this prioritization of the here and now, of pleasure, of meaning. Did you see the girl with the list on TikTok?
No.
This needs to be, for the peri-pilled out there, this needs to be a part of it. This girl wrote a 350.8-page long list and printed them out on TikTok of all of the reasons why she didn't want to have kids. And these ranged from things like literally a parasite living inside of my body to can't wear cute heels anymore to unable to do brunch with the girls. And then she printed off like a one-page list of reasons to have kids. And now like hashtag girl with the list on TikTok's got millions and billions of plays.
Amazing. Yeah. I mean, I guess she's kind of right. But the problem is that the thing you have to have on that reasons to have kids is like inexpressible joy. Which
Most
to
meaningful
me,
experience of my life.
yeah, which to me does cancel out like brunch with the girls. Well, so you can bring your baby to brunch with the girls.
You look, and when it comes to heels, look at the shoes that you've got on today. Are
Indeed. I
yeah.
never wore heels anyway. Overrated.
sparkly things. So,
Yeah.
one of
Hyperobject. Once you begin to understand this dynamic and see it, you see it all over the place. And okay, but then what to do? Let's listen to John some more on this.
And centuries of process of human activity.
Hang on, I gotta fix the sound because John's sound on that video is particularly low. And I do try to get the sound better. It's not as big an issue as it was years ago.
Etc., etc. So if I can put it this way, the temporal undulation is like, it's the Heraclitean aspect of hyperobjects. They're in this kind of perpetual flux that transcends our ability to fully grasp it. The next thing is what he calls phasing. This is that to represent hyperobjects, we often have to rely on a multi-dimensional phase space. We can't actually track it in sort of Euclidean space. We have to have multi-dimensional spaces. And in some of you who know about, chaos and other theories, we find attractors in that phase space. And then the attractors, because where does the attractor exist? Is it abstract? Is it concrete? Right? Is it inside my thought? Is it merely nominal? No. Is it just like, right? And this is the Parmenidean aspect. There's this aspect, because the attractor is kind of timeless and spaceless, right? And the point is, the hyperobject is both in Heraclitean flux and also this Parmenidean attractor in multidimensionality. Now, this brings out an implication that Dan and I drew from Morton's work. Doing all this is not something like tracking hyperobjects is not something that can be done by individual cognition, the way it's bound to particular temporal spatial phenomenology. In order to do this multidimensionality, for example, we need multiple human beings, multiple machines, multiple observations, multiple laboratories, et cetera, et cetera. We need massive distributed cognition to be able to come into a cognitive grasp. Now, this thwarts the hugely individualistic models of epistemology and cognition we have been developing since the Enlightenment. So this is also problematic for us. The next is what he calls interobjectivity. And this is the hallmark of the species of speculative realism that he comes from, which is called object-oriented ontology, people like Graham Harman and himself. So he says, we have this well-developed notion of intersubjectivity, the way you're in me and I'm in you, and I'm indwelling the other, I'm internalizing the other, and they're doing the same. We have intersubjectivity. And he says, I want you to think of that as a species of a broader genus, interobjectivity. All objects, independent of human being, are doing that with each other. Every object, right, is, right?
Now remember, he's not using objects necessarily in terms of my lens cap. In other words, the hyperobjects are in relation to each other and impacting each other as well. And they're not asking us for permission. They're not recognizing necessarily borders.
Is being internalized by objects, and objects are indwelling other objects. And then he points to features, I'll use some of my language, because object-oriented ontology resists what they call overmining and undermining. Undermining is to reduce something to its components. Overmining is to reduce something to its relationship to other things. So the object always has a moreness beyond its relations and beyond its parts, and a suchness beyond its relations and beyond its parts. The moreness is how it's an inexhaustible fount of intelligibility, and the suchness is it has a non-categorical being that we can't ever fully capture, no matter how many categories we pile on top of each other. And so the idea is, and this is what makes it a form of realism, is that objects independent of human knowledge or representation are appearing to each other and withdrawing to each other in a profound way. And
Now, if that's the case, and I think he's right, the question immediately happens, if in that ecology, why would there not be some modes of consciousness? We certainly say that there's some agency there. There's clearly agency. The agency is acting around us, often against human agency, government agency. When you look at, let's say, Japan wrestling with, or North Korea or South Korea, wrestling with these questions. You know, the irony of Korea is South Korea, where compared to North Korea, everything's dandy. North Korea, they can barely eat, and they probably don't have the kind of population decline that South Korea does. South Korea, they're just not choosing to reproduce. They have plenty to eat. So if, in fact, these objects are using agency, relating to one another, and again, just similar to the fact that I'm limited, my capacity, and I'm sure some dog psychologist knows more. For example, someone we've got training with the support animal that we're raising. Somebody said, dogs are unaware of their hind legs and their backside. Well, it doesn't mean they don't know they have one, because they're sniffing the other ones. But when I watch my dog with that in mind, my dog every now and then does something which is very strange. For example, chasing her tail. It's like, why would you chase your tail? And so one day I just kind of grabbed a hold of her tail to see, played with it a little bit to see. And then, then her tail caught her consciousness. She chased it for a minute and then went on with her life. But in other words, to what degree can we know the consciousness of dogs? Now, we struggle mightily with these hyperobjects, in fact, even recognizing that they are real. What on earth do we know of their consciousness? Now, I think part of the reason we have this bias I got to wrap this up because I have an appointment at noon. Part of the reason that we wrestle with this consciousness aspect is once you open the door to the idea that they are conscious, suddenly a world of religious practice and theory that were deeply curtailed via the Enlightenment and to a degree the Protestant Reformation suddenly opens up again. Well, what about prayer? What about church? What about ritual? Now, it's clear that sociologically we can track the impact of religion on hyperobjects. And in fact, Chris Williamson and Louise Perry will talk about that more in their conversation. But we sort of reduce that to, and this other hyperobject, sociology, because we can sort of track some of it and we can make some guesses of some of it, and we can feel our agency within these. And then, okay, well, people who go to church, yada, 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 we're sort of comfortable with that because we have a degree with psychology and sociology and economics to have a sense of, okay, we've got some agency with that. But then, of course, the degree to which we use our agency now within social media is, well, I'm going to make videos about this. And if I make video after video after video, or if I do mass marketing, or if I use propaganda or something like this, then I can move the spirits. And in fact, all of today's video about some of the young new atheists complaining about Ayaan Hirsi Ali's, in their estimation, insufficiently grounded conversion to Christianity. It's like, why are you making that video? You're doing spiritual warfare in your own mind. You are denying I completely understand that many of them, if they'd watch this video, because I hear from this, oh, this is just a bunch of woo, and there's no such thing as any of this, and you're all just paying attention. It's like, okay, but then why do you make videos? Why are you so... Why did human beings take to social media like my dog takes to food? Because something deep in you realized that, man, if I can get 1 million people to look at my meme or listen to my tweet or listen to my little speech or something like this, then I'll move the spiritual realm. Why? Because we see that happening all the time. We see Taylor Swift doing it. We see Donald Trump doing it. We see Michael Jordan doing it. We see Bernie Sanders doing it. We see Harvey Weinstein doing it. We see, this is what we're always dealing with. And it's a constant obsession in our culture that we want to change the world. Well, what exactly is this world that you're changing? And you can notice these tensions. I make this point often in the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John has all these different senses of the world. For God so loved the world. You mean he loved the squirrels? Yeah, he loves the squirrels. But why is at the same time this world evil and God so loves the world? And well, in the Gospel of John, there's different senses of the word world. So this is by no means sort of abstract or wooey or theoretical. This in fact is the predominant obsession of human beings, and really the politics that they pursue is all about this, even though politics is just sort of the business end of it. It's like the part of the legs on the table that hits the ground for a lot of people, so you can move around the table, but there's so much more table above it. Well, I am out of time, and so this video has to end. But I've given you tastes of all of these videos, and it's... The conversation will continue. Leave a message.